your appetite for candy. Just saving your appetite for candy later.
Yeah, we're just on round one.
Right. We have a tag team event today. Awesome. Shelley Dearhart, Tori, Spence, and McConnell from the Seafood Watch program, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, will be talking to us about what they do, which will be fun. So a little bit about their background. So for Shelley, okay, so she got her bachelor's in biological sciences and psychology at Clemson University, and then graduated with a master's degree then?
Master's of Science.
Master's then at college. Yeah, just say graduate. Sorry, no, that's
Oh.
PhD.
Yeah,
At the College of Charleston. So state the key state. She's in South Carolina. Right, so she's been with Seafood Watch since 2018. She's done work with marine mammals, with diamondback terrapins. Who knows what that is?
Turtle.
Turtle, yes. Fisheries conservation. Right, she's managed a number of sustainable fisheries programs. South Carolina Aquarium's Good Catch program. It's Minnesota's sustainable
You didn't
seafood
shout it out.
program. And Tori, she got her bachelor's of science from the University of Kentucky and a master's in aquaculture from the University of Rhode Island. How long have you been at Seafood Watch?
About 3 years.
3 years. And then she's involved with the aquaculture program there at Seafood Watch, researching global aquaculture sustainability, how it affects the U.S. seafood markets. And she's been involved in a lot of the working with the Seafood Watch card and doing the ratings for the species that are farmed. And let's see what else. She represented the Global Seafood Ratings Alliance. And the Seafood Watch Board is dealing for good times.
Yeah.
And before that, she did a lot of eco certifications. And there's a bunch of big acronyms here. Don't worry about that. But she's an expert in eco certification. So if you want to know how to do that, you got the pro.
I at least know where to look.
Yes. All right, so yeah, so they're going to trade off at some point and tell you about the Seafood Watch program. And then I'm actually a little early to the kids trick-or-treating, so maybe Luke, as another responsible person in the room, will help to coordinate any questions. And they have to leave as well to do, a little bit of it. So.
I also have trick or treating.
Yeah.
It's not trick-or-treating, unfortunately.
The most responsible person.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Cool.
cool.
And then,
Thank you.
here's what you need.
Yeah.
Learn more about Seafood Watch, put stickers on everything, take some straws, all good stuff.
Yeah, exactly that. Thank you so much for the intro.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So, hey everyone. Now you know everything about us. I'm sorry. Let's see if this is the right one. Yes, it is. Cool. So, yeah, I'm Tori. This is Shelley. We both work at Seafood Watch. We're both kind of split this in half here. Generally, I cover aquaculture things and she covers fishery things. There's also a lot of overlap in our program and how we function. So I'm assuming everyone's familiar at least with what Seafood Watch is. Is that a safe assumption? Looks like yes. Okay. So pretty much just oysters. So, yeah, today we're going to cover a little about our program, a little bit of the background on the theory of our program and what we cover, and then go into, we're both on the science team at the program, so we're going to go into a little bit about that, and then we're going to end with kind of the outcome of the science background and how that's used in the world beyond our little office. So to start, again, this is our intro to Seafood Watch slide. You may be familiar with us. We're a rating system. We rate your seafood either as red, yellow, or green, typical traffic light system. You can find this information either on our website, which is there. You can get an app, which also works offline very nicely. And you also, our original format was this Seafood Watch card, which we actually have a bunch over here if you want to take them with you. Lastly, one thing that a lot of people don't realize about the ratings is they are backed by a full report. And the quickest way that I've found to kind of describe what goes into that report is each report is essentially a master's thesis, but it only results in like a couple ratings. So I'm going to go into a little bit about the process behind those reports as well for you, but that's something that I think a lot of people don't realize when they just see a red, yellow, green rating. They don't realize that there's a lot of work that goes into deciding whether it's red, yellow, or green. So a little bit about the background on our team specifically. Our program's mainly divided into 3 parts. We've got the science team in the middle because we're the most important, and you should always remember that. But we also have program engagement and business engagement. Program engagement is working a lot with consumers, social media, that sort of thing. Business engagement is working with businesses, supply chain, restaurants, that sort of thing. So I'm going to cover a little bit about science team, and then at the end, Shelley's going to cover more about the program and business engagement side of things. But ultimately, we're looking to just make sure that we're not only assessing the sustainability of the seafood that is in the U.S. market, but we want to see that improve and change. So what's the point in having this information if it can't be used? A little more background on the difference between a rating system and an eco-certification system. As Scott mentioned earlier, yes, I did do some eco-certification stuff before. And basically, ratings programs and eco-certifications, they all have the same end goal. We want to assess what the sustainability is of that particular product. But there are some key differences that I just wanted to highlight here in case you were familiar with any eco-certifications or any other ratings programs. These 3 key differences are, rating systems are typically non-voluntary. We're going to assess based on what's in the market, not based on who wants an assessment. Eco-certifications are usually more at the farm level or at the fishery level. And ratings programs, especially, it's maybe, I guess we assess at the fishery level too. But for farms, it's a little bit different because of the proprietary nature of the whole industry. So we are always looking at a regional level for both farmed and wild. And typically, we don't have any costs associated with our program. Again, it's not voluntary. We're going to do it because we're looking at the market as a whole. But there are usually costs associated with being able to be inspected or to carry a label on your product for an eco-certification. So just to give you an idea of some of the coverage that our information has here, each of these color bars in the wheels is a different rating. So essentially in the US, this is how much of the market is covered by green ratings, yellow ratings, red ratings, and then blue is eco-certified ratings. Anything that is gray is in progress. That's something that is a report we're working on and should essentially cover that. But then anything white is just not covered by certifications or ratings. This is just kind of to give you some background on the broader scope of our reach. So digging a little bit into our standards, we have a fisheries standard and we have an aquaculture standard. And also we have a salmonid standard through the fisheries. But that's, you can find them all on our website at this address, seafoodwatch.org/standards. We are in the middle of a standard review process right now. We typically review our standards every 3 to 5 years. And they are, and in order to review them, we ourselves are looking at them, but then we're also vetting that with a bunch of different experts. And ultimately, we don't officially decide what's in our standards or not. We have a group called the multi-stakeholder group, and that's essentially our voting body. So we bring them the standard changes that we would propose to make, and they're the ones that decide whether or not those changes are going into effect for our standards. So our standards want to cover all species, all production systems or gear types at all geographic at all geographic scales, locations. So ultimately we want it to be achievable, but we also want to keep pushing that bar. And just a quick overview on our assessment process. So remember I said those ratings are backed by these long reports. In order to write those reports, the reports are reviewed again every 3 to 5 years or so. But we start by confirming the scope of the assessment, and then we move into pulling all the information together based on what we'll need. Again, usually we're looking at what's in the US market, and then we'll create a draft, and that's reviewed internally between an analyst and a reviewer. And once they agree on the justification and the scoring, that is then sent out for peer review. And so it's usually sent out for about a month to people who either helped inform the assessment or are experts in that particular species or location. Once that peer review comes back, we incorporate all those comments, do another round of internal review, and then the last thing to do is called a finalization session, which is essentially kind of a quick defense of, okay, here are the driving factors for the score. This is what we know, and it's kind of like a last chance for any new information to come to light. On the aquaculture side of things, our standard covers 10 criteria, one of which is data, so that isn't really an ecological factor, but that kind of underpins the rest of the standard. So the data criterion is actually, this is an example of a score of 10 from the data criterion. It's actually something that we find to be really important and informational for understanding kind of your confidence in the assessment of the rating. So the fisheries standard doesn't have the data specifically built out like we do, but that's just kind of a difference in how we do our assessments. So as you can see, for a score of 10 for data availability, it's kind of like the gold standard of what you'd want to put in your report. And we do seek data from any source that we can get. And having this data score allows us to kind of say, well, we couldn't find any peer-reviewed literature on it, or we could find it only in one location and we couldn't confirm it in other ways. So having the data score kind of gives that confidence level on the background of the report itself. And this is just an example of another one of the ecological criteria that we have in our standard, a score of 10 or an 8. Both of these would be a green score within this particular criterion. And you can kind of see how data quality and availability can play a role in how everything else is scored. So here I'm going to be handing it over to Shelley to give us some information about the fisheries standard.
So yeah, jumping into the wild side of things, our standards and criteria look a little bit different than aquaculture, a lot different actually. We don't have nearly the number of factors that they have to consider in order to get to our outcome. And so just to give you a quick run through of the different factors that we do take into account, we look at the target species that we're trying to assess. We look at other species or bycatch in the fishery. We look at management and habitat and ecosystems. That criterion 5X has everything to do with salmon. I am not a salmon expert by any means. My boss is, so if you have any questions about that, we can redirect you to him. But that is basically, it takes into account the fact that there are hatchery releases that affect natural populations in the fisheries out there. And so we are, I think, just actually getting ready to, we're going through our standard revision. Tori mentioned that process a little bit. Where we're going to be implementing these factors into our new reports coming out for standards coming up, or for salmon coming up. So that's going to be kind of a new little addition that we're going to be, I guess, kind of launching. But I'm going to dive a little deeper into how we use our criteria and how we come up with our recommendations. So this is just a very itty bitty, teeny tiny little snapshot of our very first, when I showed you those blocks, the target species that we're looking at. This is under that first criterion. So we're looking in that target species, we look at abundance and we look at fishing mortality. So when we're trying to figure out how to score something, just to walk you through it, and we have categories from very low, moderate, and high concern. This obviously just takes you down to that low, but just to give you an example, when we're looking at information, we have to make sure that all these boxes are checked. We want to make sure that there's a recent stock assessment or that there's an update that's been approved. I'm not going to read through all of this with you, with y'all, obviously, but we walk through to make sure those boxes are checked, and if one of them's missing, then we go down to that low concern and we walk through that to see if those boxes are checked. And if not, then you go to moderate or high. There's a number associated with each category, each score level, and ultimately we give all the factors an overall score determined by this criteria, and then we take the geometric mean of that score, and it's all done by a fancy little system online that sometimes likes to work for us. It's always a good day when it does. Anyway, we come up with that overall score recommendation, and that is what determines if it's that red, yellow, or green. So moving on, just to give you a better visual. So this would be that target species again, criterion 1. This is a report that I just finished. It was presented at the ranking session Tori mentioned this past November. And when you come in as an analyst, I started there July of 2018. You're given a report to write, and you move into kind of more of an editing role after you. I guess I've been doing a little bit of both, but you get a report to finish just so that you kind of dive in head first and learn that criteria, learn the system, and somebody's actually reviewing your work before you review other people's. This took me over a year and a half. It was 14 recommendations. It was a huge report full of northwest, or I guess it is Northwest Atlantic bottom trawl flatfish. And so just to give you an idea of how long some of these reports can take, they can take years to finish. That's, talking about how much work goes into coming up with these recommendations, it's pretty significant. So looking at this summer flounder, just again as an example, you can see it was bottom trawl. We're looking at Mid-Atlantic and New England, which, there are all sorts of fun little nuances as you move down the line that come into play with how these scores can differ depending on the type of gear you're using or the management plan that they're under. But for abundance, we had some recent stock assessments that actually took this score from our previous report. It was a high concern because they were overfishing was occurring, and it took it down to a low concern because they are no longer experiencing that. That was fishing mortality. With abundance, they were doing pretty well already. They were not overfished. But ultimately, those scores, putting them in, is what gave us that overall low concern score for that particular category. And this is not all of the recommendations, but this is kind of what that overall outcome looks like. You can see the scores that are given for each of those factors, the impact on the species itself, on bycatch, this is bottom trawl, not great. Management itself has about 5 different categories under the overall management tier. You want to look at strategy, you want to look at bycatch mitigation, you want to look at enforcement, you have to look at stakeholder involvement. So all of those scores come together to ultimately determine how this is going to come out. And then finally, you look at some factors affecting habitat and ecosystem. So you can see a handful came out, all right. Others not so much. So getting into like, why do all this? There's this whole theory of change that we're working towards. And with Seafood Watch, it starts with consumers. We want to educate and engage with consumers to make better decisions about the choices they make when it comes to purchasing seafood. And know that their purchase has power to make a difference in the bigger picture of helping to create more sustainable fisheries. So you create market demand by our outreach team, our people that are going out and setting up tables and engaging with consumers as they're coming to festivals or even at the seafood counter at Whole Foods or wherever you get your seafood. Engaging with those folks and creating that educated consumer can make a huge difference, again, in that bigger picture of purchasing. So as the consumer demands more, other businesses that may be less engaged are going to start wanting to make more sustainable choices. And even the ones that are engaged can become more and more so. Just as another example, and I say Whole Foods because I've worked with them a good bit in their sustainability realm over the past couple of years. They have a huge dedication to sustainable fisheries. And we'll kind of get into those commitments, not too much in detail, but essentially they make the commitment they're not going to sell anything that is rated avoid. So they can only sell seafood that is either a good alternative, best choice, so that yellow or green, or if it's MSC certified, the Marine Stewardship Council, or they have their own aquaculture. Yeah. So they've got their standards, but when it comes to wild caught fish, it's just that green or yellow. And so if you saw those avoids that came up with those Atlantic flatfish, they can't sell those. They've made that commitment to us. They've made that commitment to all of you. And so, that's one thing that they've definitely done. Something they're moving towards more so is looking at all the canned fish that they sell and the fish that you would get maybe in their prepared market area. They're working to get more and more in that realm of only making sure that they're selling that green and yellow. So there's always room for progress. It's not an easy easy thing to make happen, obviously, or else everybody would be serving sustainable fish. We wouldn't be having this conversation. And then you have producers that actually start making change. And so when the businesses, the people that are actually purchasing the fish, obviously from the producers, from the fishermen themselves, from the processors, those middlemen sometimes, when the businesses are demanding change, that's going to start making change with those producers themselves. And finally, we can get into that government change, that larger scale, make it official, make it law, that these things X, Y, and Z has to happen to protect our resource, to protect the environment, to protect your food system. So it's a pretty cool system. It's very simplified here, obviously, but there's a lot that goes into, the idea that consumers starting here can make a pretty big difference in the long run. These are just some of our kind of larger scale partners. Even this past year, we've been making some transitions in our business side of things in terms of how we connect with restaurants and larger scale industry. And so looking at new partners like Red Lobster, Chicken of the Sea, the amount of seafood that they purchase is huge. And so for them to make this commitment to want to work towards, and I don't know all the details behind what they're committing to at this point, but working towards having a more sustainable menu and making more sustainable purchases, it's pretty incredible. Because you can kind of, even if you don't understand the market that well, you can see how it would start to move that needle just a little bit, probably even a lot of a bit. So again, just some of the examples of some of the larger scale businesses that we connect with to make this change. And then who's using the ratings? We talked a little bit about consumers. Nobody's expecting any consumers really to pull up our website and dive into a 150-page report and learn everything there is to know about flatfish. We do offer some nice little summaries, so that comes along with our app or these little wallet cards that we have. It's just an informational reference that hopefully if you start using it more, you can kind of start to pick up, little bits and pieces that might help you navigate to the answers you're looking for more quickly. The more you familiarize yourself with the material. It's a great way to start a conversation. My biggest thing, my previous experience was less on the science side of working with fisheries and more on that outreach side, working with consumers, working with chefs, that sort of thing, the businesses. And having a way to start that conversation and build trust with the people that you're interacting with when it comes to your seafood it's just invaluable. You for yourself as a consumer, but also just in terms of creating that change because it becomes such a natural part of your everyday. So definitely pick up some wallet cards and check out the app when you have a chance. Working with chefs, it's having them be able to utilize our ratings. It's such a quick and easy way for them to make a purchasing decision. And yes, chefs, they're reaching, especially lately in these past, decade maybe, celebrity status. So obviously that can have a lot of pull whenever you're trying to make change. But even, the chefs that I worked with back home, they were rock stars to me, but they aren't out in the media every day. And most of you probably wouldn't know who they are coming, from the East Coast. And I look at the change that they made in their restaurant and how many people came through and sat down at their tables and learned a little bit about the fish that they were eating and actually found value in that and could take that away with them. The chef is making those decisions, sometimes it goes a little higher to that business level of the owner, but ultimately that chef is going to work with products that they care about and they find value in and are proud of. And so the change that a chef can make in terms of, again, moving this needle is pretty huge. Students, you guys, y'all can definitely, take this information. Hopefully, maybe it can help you with, work that you're doing. And if not your work, then again, just making more informed decisions on your seafood purchases. Industry itself, fishermen, they can take a look at our ratings and use us as a resource if they, want to know how they could be doing something better, or maybe they shouldn't be fishing for certain species, or, helping them to understand the bigger picture sometimes when you're in kind of a focused, position, and you can have that conversation when it comes to that economic side of things too. And then businesses, we've already kind of discussed that a little bit. But lots of players, lots of potential change. And before we move into, we just have one other question that we want to ask after this. But did you get kind of a fairly well-rounded idea of our ratings process and, what we're doing back at Seafood Watch? And do you have any questions about that at this point? Yeah. If you need snacks, you can take them. I feel like this is actually working. I know it's just for the webinar.
So bravo to you guys. I mean, I'm a big proponent of your program. I use your app all the time. I guess when we're talking about seafood sustainability, the thing that always, comes to mind for me is that this is, a very global, widespread issue. And I feel like thus far, what you've talked about is kind of almost a niche market and like a very small portion of what's actually going on, talking with chefs and businesses and kind of a small subset of that, and talking to consumers, you're talking to marine scientists right now. I think we're all, kind of on the same page. We want to eat sustainably when we can. But I guess my question is, how do we make this more applicable and wide-ranging to kind of this global problem we're really facing?
So I'm just going to say, Tori's, I'm going to let her take over because, we are, aquaculture is such like a crazy, huge, amazing, thing that can help in that realm. And there is a lot of work going on in our aquaculture department that will touch on that. So I'm just wanted to, yay.
Yeah, actually the first thing that comes to mind is also something I should have pointed out at the beginning is how much of our seafood we import. So we're talking about the U.S. market, but gosh, it's probably it depends on if you're talking about just fisheries or aquaculture combined, and then there's obviously a lot of gray area in the stats, but it's 80-85%, I believe, combined of our seafood is imported. And then you, of course, have questions about shipping it to other countries and shipping it back, even if it was caught or raised here. But all of that aside, we are part of a global market, part of a global industry, and we're a pretty big player in that. And so part of that is recognizing that our market, this is from the Seafood Watch perspective. Our market is an incentive, essentially, and being able to sell on the U.S. market is the incentive. So something that the Seafood Watch program brings to the global stage is if you want to sell on the U.S. market, it's probably good to try and be green or yellow. Again, because we're a regional approach, but it's similar to certifications. You can get a stamp that'll help you sell in very high-end niche markets. But the thing is, because we're importing so much, and we are using so much of really only a couple key species. For the aquaculture side, salmon and shrimp are the big ones, and that's really large for throughout the U.S. So we are kind of focusing at Seafood Watch some of our initiatives on actually putting some of the reports into action. So we've only really covered the reports today, essentially, like what we do to research this. The other side of it is what we're trying to do to utilize that research and make sure at least somebody is utilizing that information. So salmon and shrimp are two very different industries. Salmon is a pretty high-end, very well-developed, usually a developed nation kind of industry. It's also very, I don't want to say monopoly, but you have a lot of really large companies. They're all kind of operating in the same area. And then you have kind of the same, even larger companies that are owning all of the same salmon companies throughout the world. So that's a very different situation from shrimp, where you might have a bunch of processing companies that are very large and can export, but they're buying from individual shareholder farmers. And so when you're talking about ecological sustainability, because that's our main focus here, you really have two very different issues to address. On one hand, you've got like for lack of a better word, a factory farm, which would be on the salmon side. That's what they tend to be termed. And then you have shrimp, which is a whole bunch of very small individual farms, but they, as a whole, have an impact. So yeah, we have two main initiatives going on right now. One working with a large shrimp company in Vietnam, and also one working within the salmon industry and kind of bringing together the industry, NGOs, governments, really to address kind of two main issues in each region that we've identified through our assessments. So if you want to know more about that and each of those initiatives, we can give you more information later. I've also got my card here, and we can give you Shelley's email. You can email either of us at any point too, because we're always happy to talk about this stuff. But that was a very long-winded response to your question. But you're right, it is a global problem, and we are trying to help find and facilitate solutions. Good?
So you had that nice infographic from the consumers going all the way up to the government regulations. How important are the consumers actually? I mean, from what you guys are in Whole Foods. The impression I get with ratings and certifications is that they approach the businesses, the large ones, and those ones effectively tell the consumers what they want to eat. But to your point, those are people with money. I mean, how effective would doing something like that, getting the Safeways on board? Like how important truly are the consumers? You have your outreach teams that go out to them, but is it really getting these large supermarket chains to sign on? Is that the kind of thing that really moves the needle?
I'm going to throw my 2 cents in if you want to add anything or
I think you've got most of this one.
I think it's something that there's not a determined right answer at this point. I think the industry itself and sustainable fisheries, we're still trying to figure out what is that best, method. This is something that we do see there. We have seen positive results. We have seen change starting with this consumer approach. That being said, I understand all too well that, the financial side of it and to your point, there are a lot of more accessible stores, your Publix, your, I say Publix. Do we have that here? No, that's back home. Yeah, there's so the Safeway level maybe that are kind of jumping on board with this, and that does sound like it's kind of starting with that industry or that business side of things, but that's part of the education to the consumers as well. And so it's a little bit of a gray area, I feel like. It's not, I don't think just educating consumers is like all you can do to start. I think it's a combination of those things, but I think this is how Seafood Watch kind of started. And a lot of other, programs, ours, the one I used to run back home, we were kind of on that same page, but it's certainly not a super streamlined start with X and YZ type thing, but I do think it's getting to a point where the whole accessibility thing is it's been such a challenge, but being able to get some of these larger businesses on board. I mean, you think about again, it's that volume, even just going to the restaurant level, and I hope I'm not getting too far off course, but I worked with a chef he was probably my best partner back home. He had a way higher volume on a regular basis coming through his door than a lot of the higher end chefs that we worked with. And it was easy for them to go down to, the local fishermen, and their daily catch is what their entire menu was local and sustainable and, beautifully caught, hook and line, all the things. And this other chef, he was turning over, hundreds of people in an evening, and it was a lot more of a challenge for him to be able to, make the changes that he wanted to make. But it wasn't perfect, but his dedication was there, and he looked for opportunities. And I think you're seeing some of that in those larger scale businesses as well, with the Safeways, and which I hate saying that because I don't know if I don't even know if they're doing anything. I don't know what they're doing.
I'm not sure.
But there was another restaurant chain I heard just recently, and even food. Do y'all know Food Lion? I don't.
Food Lion's
No,
another East
okay. I'm gonna
Coast.
stop using names,
Southern.
but y'all get the point. Like I think there is a transition of trying to be able to make it more accessible and B, getting some of those like larger scale businesses that are accessible on board with that education side of things. So I don't know if that like fully answered that question, but it's gray. It's not a perfect system. We just I feel like we just read a paper not too long ago about this whole like theory of change, and you were in that meeting, right? And just like, is this the best way to go about it? Like, I mean, it's a very large discussion, and I don't know that we have the answers completely, but until we have a better one, maybe.
I have a little bit to add, actually.
Please do.
So thinking about just this slide in particular, it's a very like one way. The origin is the consumer, and that is the only thing that works. I mean, internally, we really think about it much more like a food web than a food chain, essentially. So it's just kind of hard to depict it well in a PowerPoint presentation without it being too wordy. But there is a lot of interplay that goes on between consumers and the restaurants or the businesses. But even that aside, that's part of the reason we have the business team, because their whole job is to go and engage with those businesses that are not immediately touching the consumers. So trying to have some sort of a hand on any point in the supply chain of the fish itself, because we recognize that consumers are not the only driver, and it really kind of depends on the market, depends on the size and the scale of the particular restaurant or seafood purchasing organization, and it also depends on the source and all of the factors that go into either the fishery or the aquaculture production. So that's kind of a little more background into it too. Yeah, there's never a silver bullet, but the theory has to start somewhere, and then you kind of just keep adjusting to see. We do also have monitoring and evaluation. We didn't cover that in our presentation, but we have a team devoted to asking those questions. What are our strategies? Are we doing what we say we're doing? And if we're not, what are some of the other things that are going into it, and how do we adjust to make sure we're still doing that? Does that help?
I got another one if no one else does.
Yeah, that's fine.
So you have a fairly simplistic traffic light system, right? But then you talk about these 150-page reports.
Yeah.
Do you have a quantifiable like metric to come up with that kind of color? If you've got this gigantic report, at the end of the day, it needs to be simplistic for the consumer. But how do you get that? Do you have like crazy matrix that goes through and it spits out the color for you, or
We have a Wheel of
Fortune wheel?
Sorry, was that? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, just like, do you have like a quantifiable matrix to come up with the color system, or is it more kind of subjective, people weighing this up with that to come up with your color system?
It's a whole lot of fun when you have to dig into the details of it, and that's something we've been doing a lot when we're digging through our standard this past year. So I just pulled this back up to point out. I guess I could have pulled the fisheries one up too. It's more simple. But yeah, there's 10 criteria here, and then each one of these criteria, a lot of them have sub-factors. And so we have a bunch of different ways that we're scoring and determining scoring. Some of this is based only on like, we have a risk-based version and a data evidence-based version. And one that I wanted to point out in particular is the feed criterion. That one tends to have a lot of calculations in it. We have 3 main sub-factors and then some more sub-factors from there. And so that all gets kind of filtered down through. And then of course to actually produce that score, on our side we have an Excel sheet that's been kind of programmed to plug and chug for us. But that is all the theory and the calculations and everything behind that is actually like in our standard. But it takes a little bit of work to pull it all out if you're trying to look and understand exactly what the scoring is. But these snapshots that we had here are examples of, like with chemical use, do we have a production system that's closed? So there's no concern for any chemicals that are used to be getting into the environment. Things like that, where is there evidence that it's a closed production system? If it is, cool, it's probably in the 10. Or like what Shelley was going through earlier with, you kind of go down through our examples that we have in our scoring table and see where it meets up. But of course, we only have a couple of examples in each scoring table, so it leads to a lot of discussions, leads to a lot of questions to outside experts. This is something that comes through in peer review a lot, of making sure we have what we need. And you could probably give some more background on the fishery side for that too.
The only other thing that I would add to that is that, yes, there's clearly going to be tons of examples where you have a situation and you're like, well, I think it's kind of outlined here, but like, I'm not 100% sure. So every week we sit down just as a fisheries team, and I think these guys do it as well, and we bring up where we're a little bit like uncertain about making sure that we're scoring something appropriately. So our entire team sits down, we have a discussion. A lot of times, like what seems like gonna be the simplest question takes the entire hour to discuss. And so it's very, we get a lot of different mindsets that come at it just to make sure that we're making the best decision. And on top of that, you add that pure, that scientific, I don't want to call it peer review, but scientific review, by at least 3 different people, that's just one more filter to kind of like make sure that they agree and are on board with how, we've assessed, a particular portion of this, well, the whole assessment, but, maybe a particular portion of it. So we can highlight certain things that we're feeling kind of really uncertain about, and just get a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Feedback.
Expert feedback
Yeah.
on it. So, yeah. Does that
Yeah,
help a little bit?
there's no it's almost a qualitative way of doing a quantitative analysis. So there is still a lot of room for interpretation, but we have a lot of work internally to try and keep that interpretation fairly consistent.
So the score itself is done internally, but if there's questions, you ask external people if that's a fair score or not.
It's part of peer review. So we are always sending it out, usually with the scores in it, saying, here's our justification. Is there any information here that we're missing? And if there is, let us know what it is, because sometimes that could change the score. Usually the scoring decisions, we don't leave that up to every peer reviewer, but we do take that into account when we get it back, understanding, because we always have to you kind of pull all the bullet points out of the paragraph of justification you've written, being like, okay, it hits these targets. It also hits this one target that's actually in a different scoring category. Sometimes you do an intermediate score because of that sort of thing. Sometimes it can come down to scale of the industry, or if you have, in the case of aquaculture, if you have kind of 2 main areas that are producing within a country, and one is producing a lot more, but they're subject to maybe less tight regulation, then that's going to kind of influence the score more towards the precautionary end of things, that sort of thing. So it's never perfect. There's a lot of discussion.
I have a question about salmon farming. So
Yeah.
there's obviously been a lot in the news recently about, the negative effects of farming salmon on the environment and the ecosystem. And I guess I just wanted to know, from your guys' perspective, are there any sustainable salmon farms currently?
Yeah, we have a couple of we have red ratings. Good one. We do have some yellow and green rated salmon in our database. The biggest country level one that comes to mind is, it's actually a regional level one, BC, up in British Columbia. All of the salmon in British Columbia right now is under a report that meets the yellow bar. And also, there are a couple of small operations in Maine that meet yellow. The Orkney Islands in Scotland, not the entire country. The rest of the country is considered red. The Faroe Islands are also yellow. And there are a couple of very small pockets in Norway that are considered yellow. But it's really interesting when you look at the salmon reports throughout all of the main producing regions. That would be BC, Chile, Scotland, Norway. Those are kind of the big ones. Each one, you know, even between like Chile and Norway, they have very different issues that they're dealing with, but they both have a red rating. So it's really unfair to kind of paint all salmon farming as negative. And I think that it's really important too to always be thinking critically about what can be done well. That we shouldn't be automatically saying like, you just can't do that. Let's maybe think about what can be done well with it. And sometimes it doesn't work for every area, every ecosystem. Scale factors in a lot. The scale of the industry, concentration of the industry factors in a lot. But our theory at Seafood Watch is really not to sit and bash production for the sake of bashing it. If we see something that can be done better, we want to be able to highlight that so that it can be utilized. So again, the example of Chile, one of the main drivers there is chemical use. And chemical use is actually, nothing's ever simple. So chemical use is actually kind of based on a whole long chain of like, well, they're treating a disease, but it's actually because of this other parasite, which is also because of a disease, and maybe also because of a concentration thing. So it's never one thing, and you have to understand how everything kind of plays into itself. And it's also, I think, really important too to point out that it's a bit unfair to just look at it as just the industry's problem, because sometimes it comes down to the management, what's allowed, what's not allowed, or maybe not allowing something that could be a benefit ecologically and then also for the industry. So there's a lot of factors that come in there. I often get on my soapbox about let's not just sit here and bash farmed fish, but it is important also to recognize that there are some things that can be done better, and we hope that our reports and the information that we're generating can be used to help both educate and also look into solutions. Any other questions? Okay. All right, go for it.
So I'm interested to know, like, what's the issue or the perceived issue with the wild caught salmon, but with the artificial breeding programs? Because depending on the state or the species, that can be upwards of 90% of salmon caught come out of a hatchery. So
Yeah.
you guys are addressing this now. So what is the is it integration?
Yeah, so I'm gonna, the little bit that I do know, and if I don't answer this to your satisfaction, again,
We'll
I will
give
give
you
you my
Sam's
boss's
email.
email address. So I've just been kind of like scraping the surface of learning about all of this since I got to Seafood Watch, and so there's this, and there was also a conference I just got back from that kind of highlighted a lot of the issues here. But there's like a localized adaptation loss when you bring in large amounts of hatchery-raised smolt and release them into the ecosystem, and it's like they're to some degree, I guess, outcompeting the native natural salmon in that particular stream, and it can be so localized that it is like each particular stream, and so that's one thing, and then I guess another is just the potential of that straying. So I guess trying to work through what my head has been full of salmon for. It was full of salmon for a week. But so releasing them and having them potentially return to other streams where they could be interbreeding, I guess, with salmon that they, just mixing with the genetics of it. And then there's also an issue with the, I want to say it's something about prey, competition once they get out into the ocean. And I can't tell you the details there. I'm not going to try. But those are kind of three areas that I know there is concern. And I will get you Sam Wilding's email address, and you can talk to him about that all day long.
So we did, you have another question?
No, finish what you were gonna say.
Well, I was just going to say, we did have one more slide. We wanted to throw a question at you guys, but we are still down to answer more questions.
Yeah, as we've been talking, a lot of times you've brought up the concept of scale, and I have to kind of play devil's advocate here and say that I don't know, I guess it occurs to me that like while you're doing all these sustainable practices, like a lot of these fisheries I imagine that are more sustainable on a smaller scale, but as you are intentionally shifting the market towards valuing these small scale fisheries, aren't you then, by nature of our economy, upscaling these small scale fisheries and kind of, I guess, how do we break that cycle of like a fishery starts out sustainable and then as it becomes more popular, it becomes less sustainable? Like how do we break that cycle? That's my question.
That's a question we're constantly asking. Yeah, no, you're totally right. Like, yeah, sure, something's great and sustainable at a very small scale, but like, as you scale up, it could potentially be unsustainable. Maybe not. Our goal is to, you know, if it's a small scale now, our goal is to try and incentivize a sustainable growth. So, Shelley may
and I
have
was
more
just
on
going
that
to
too.
say, like, management obviously plays a large role in that, and making sure that the appropriate management is being enforced. So if, like, that's all part of that puzzle. So in theory, you know, if you have a sustainable fishery and it's been deemed so, and it's going to be regulated in a way that won't necessarily, hopefully, allow it to, you know, reach that point that you're referencing. So again, that's theory, and that's not always the case. I know there was a little while ago, there was a lot of talk about, you know, forage fish is obviously a big issue when it comes to sustainability, and we're using all of these forage fish to feed other fish and getting, you know, less actual product versus what we're taking out of the ocean, that whole, you know, system. And then, you know, then there's this push to get, you know, more people to actually eat the forage fish. But I mean, that's a challenge in and of itself. But so if you start pushing that too much, then, you know, it's just maybe your reach is further in terms of feeding people, but is that still fixing that sustainability problem? And what happens if people all of a sudden start liking it? I mean, you look at the Chilean sea bass, you know, like that's Patagonian toothfish, you know, that's that situation of like something starting very small and then exploding, and then all of a sudden you see this like complete collapse. And, you know, we're actually just getting back to a point where certain fisheries are sustainably managed. And it was actually the fishermen in those cases that have gotten it to that point, which is a really cool story, from my perspective. But anyway, like there's so many different there's so many different ways that you know, that outcome could go. But I hope that if we and hopefully maybe our reports help in this bigger picture understanding of that. But like you figure out a system that's like, okay, this seems to be working. Hold on to it. You know, keep managing in a way that doesn't allow it to expand to a point that it's no longer sustainable.
I think it's good to point out too that small doesn't necessarily mean sustainable. Yeah. Like there are, at least maybe on the aquaculture side, I can think of plenty of reports where we've got, you know, only a couple of farms in an area, but just like maybe just the problem with the amount of nitrogen they're pumping, and you know, like you can have unsustainable impacts from a very small industry, and it may still result in an overall like medium yellow rating, but that's still something to take into consideration. And again, as things grow, we would ideally reassess them because we're assessing every like 3 years. So ideally that would be caught or at least like identified if that industry is trying to grow. Yeah. So just our last question to toss back at you guys. We were just kind of interested to hear from you, kind of what you're interested in professionally, and how what we're doing here might play into your future work. And if you don't know, that's okay.
Any brave souls? Yeah.
Go for it.
I'm studying aquaculture, and I'm hoping that one day I could maybe work with you guys.
What are you interested in assessing?
Kind of like I really want to learn more about how like we can turn industry into because industry is going to be what supplies this growing population, right? We need to like create more and more food for people, and so, you know, changing the idea that industry can't be or like won't be a bad thing, but it'll be a good thing because you can develop like a positive feedback between industry and the world, because like the industry they have the money to solve the issues, and I don't know, kind of like make it better for both.
Yeah, you'd like to see industry putting more effort and investment into actually sustainable growth and
Yeah.
yeah, that's what we're into. Go for it.
So I do a lot of research on how climate change affects oyster growth and development. Now I'm working on rockfish, some salmon stuff. And so I guess being in communication with Seafood Watch about how climate change is going to affect the future populations of these species. And I don't know, maybe that's something that you guys are already doing, like working with climate scientists and that type of thing. But I feel like there could be like a big kind of alliance and help, have the climate science kind of help inform the current rating that the Seafood Watch is putting out, even if right now the population looks super healthy, if because of climate change that population is projected to decline, kind of be in communication about what type of rating it gets and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. I can see how that can play in together, and that's the kind of information I think that we try to utilize in our assessments wherever possible. Right now we are trying to do a snapshot of what things are currently, but it's also hard to kind of do that without also incorporating some sort of projection in there too. So yeah, all those factors that go into climate change that you guys are looking at are things that affect the abundance of the fish or the oysters. No one else? That's all right.
I think I just wanted to take a second. I mean, part of the reason that we wanted to put this slide in there was not to put you guys on the spot by any means. And I'm sure, I don't know, it took me forever to figure out what the heck I was doing or what direction I was going in anyway. But, just thinking about the presentation and what you saw, not just as you're learning about Seafood Watch reports, but thinking outside of the box in terms of how you might be able to apply a certain technique or a certain way of thinking to what you are interested in, even if it's not directly what we presented to you today. And also just taking advantage of the fact that just the connection part of it. Just make sure to grab Tori's card. I forgot mine, sorry. But happy to write my email down as well. We're always here. We're super supportive of anybody getting into their future goals, and it's all about connections. And even if we don't have your answers that you're looking for, we still have a pretty large reach. And so being able to connect you guys with other people that you're interested in connecting with too. Just wanted to kind of put all of that out there. So that's it.
Yeah, so thank you guys so much for all the great questions and engaging in discussion here. And we actually have to jet in a minute, but again, we're down to chat anytime, and we don't live that far away. So definitely look us up, take swag. I went and got it out of the swag closet today, and I'm leaving it here. So yeah, thank you again.